let's get started. First of all, just going to double check here. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep.
All right, sounds good. So this is the 4th edition of our Kubernetes Cloud Native online meetup. And today we have Mark. Mark is from Tremolo Security. He's actually one of the founders of the company. He is based in Washington, D.C. in the States. We have people from, I think, all over the world here. So just to give you a little reference, it's about noon over there. And we are very excited to have him. We're going to have hopefully a very good discussion today. I believe he's going to be running a bit of a demo. Correct, Mark? Yep. And we are going to let him get right to it. But before we do, just a little bit of logistical things. This meeting is recorded, so keep that in mind. We are going to have about 45-50 minutes of presentation, give or take. And the rest of the time will be allocated to question and answer. The way that we will run that is that you can send me a message privately on the chat with your question, and I will read your question out loud, just so it doesn't get too messy on the group chat. After that, we'll leave the group chat open for some discussion, and then everyone can go on about their day, and we will have the video up and running soon. So without any further ado, yes, so Julian just mentioned here that you can help spread the word about this talk. So we're still expecting some people to show up, like Rob just did. People will probably still be popping in throughout the talk, but if you want to help spread the word, you can share the link to the video. So without any further ado, we'll have Mark talk. He'll introduce himself, and then he'll get on with his presentation. You can take it over, Mark.
Thanks, Johan. Thanks for having or giving me this opportunity to be able to present. I'm hoping that the subject it's still pretty new, but a lot of folks are talking about it. So let me go ahead. Can you all see my screen?
Yep, it's up.
Okay, cool. So get rid of. I don't need to see me. Okay, cool. There we go. That's good enough. So we're going to talk about identity management in Kubernetes. We're going to talk about both SSO and RBAC. These are both topics that have been coming up a lot lately, especially since 1.3 came out. And so there's a lot of interesting things about it and a lot of very powerful things that you can do with it. Of course, if I knew how to use my Mac, that would help. So real quick introduction to who I am, who's Tremolo Security. We were founded in 2010 based on 10 plus years of experience in identity management. Microsoft, open source, IBM, Oracle, CA, Ping, SailPoint, automotive, beverage, financials, federal, U.S. federal, telco, cable. So a lot of experience deploying all these different types of identity management software, most of the time being brought in after a project has been deemed failed. And so with a lot of that experience in turning those types of projects around, we just thought there was a better way to go. So we started Tremolo Security, and not to get too deep into who we are, you'll see kind of our open source edition, Open Unison here, as part of showing off this integration. So why? Why SSO and why RBAC? And I break these up into two different categories because they serve overlapping but very important distinct roles. With SSO, the first one you're going to run into is compliance, especially if you're working in something that anybody who's dealt with it will know what I mean by covered applications. At least in the US, this is typically financials, health-based, things like that, where you have to comply with certain regulations, Sarbanes-Oxley, HIPAA, etc. And a lot of that, when it comes to the security side of things, is centralized credential management. And so SSO makes that a lot easier. You also get better security. Managing individual credentials is hard. It's difficult. And so having that centralized system makes a better security experience. And I, at least personally, and maybe I'm biased because I've been doing this so long, but I think it's easier. One less thing to remember is always a good thing. It leads to less things being written down on stickies on my desk. So, there's that aspect as well. And then one that I don't really mention here, but, would be important for anybody trying to sell the idea of using Kubernetes in a corporate environment. It just makes it easier to deploy. You're focusing more on your Kubernetes deployment rather than managing users. RBAC, a lot of the same ideas. Compliance still comes up. Multi-tenancy is one that gets talked about a lot, but I would argue that even in a non-multi-tenant environment, if you're deploying Kubernetes just for a single application or set of common applications, that even a simple RBAC model can give you a lot of power. For instance, you're using external monitoring solutions. You might want to be able to provide a simple set of URLs that they can access rather than giving them just a certificate and letting them have at it. And then finally, you might have some different roles inside of your team, and monitoring being one of them that you might want to think about. So let's talk about what Kubernetes and identities are. There are no identities in Kubernetes. We're talking about identity management, yet there are none, except for service accounts. In fact, if it had not been already said on the OpenStack side because of the new build system, this title actually would have been "There are no identities, there is only Zool." Everything has to be asserted to Kubernetes. There is no internal user store. Right now, Kubernetes doesn't know how to talk to an LDAP directory, but that's been discussed. And this is very different from OpenShift. So I started off in the OpenShift world before I started with stock Kubernetes. And in OpenShift, you do have a centralized identity management store. It's very simple, but there is something that you can interact with to say, who is this user and what groups do they have? You can't do that with Kubernetes. So that offers some very powerful decisions, but also some interesting choices that you need to make. And when it comes to SSO, it's just OpenID Connect. There's no SAML 2. I'd be really surprised if SAML 2 is ever supported. I'm sure somebody's asked for it. But just given the fact that most interaction with Kubernetes happens using web services, and OpenID Connect is really a lot, I want to say, better for web services, because that could really spark a religious war. But it's been adopted much more for web services. And given how powerful the existing implementation is, I just don't see SAML 2 really being something that becomes super likely, at least in the near term. Now, one thing to remember is, again, this is APIs, and there's no system for redirect. So when you talk about an SSO solution, you're usually talking about, okay, I go to my web app, like Google Apps for Enterprise or whatnot. I go to my app, it redirects me to an identity provider, I put in my information, it bounces me back, bada bing, bada boom, I have a session. That redirect system doesn't exist in Kubernetes. So if you're going to add an SSO solution, you have to figure out a couple of things. One is, how do you trigger the authentication? And then two, how do you get your token and start using it inside of Kubernetes with kube control command? Very easy, but it's just things you have to think about. And then finally, the dashboard. Dashboard's not RBAC aware. I mean, the dashboard just integrates or interacts with the various web services, but it has no idea of who you are. It's just this tool that runs, and security is just something that you got to think about. There is an open issue that has been actively discussed on how to make dashboard more identity aware. But as of right now, that doesn't exist. So if you're going to use the dashboard, you got to take some very specific precautions around it. Time check here. Okay. So I've been told that every presentation needs at least one meme. Here's my first one. Remember, all these features in Kubernetes 1.3 around SSO and RBAC are alpha. They are subject to change, and there's been active discussion about changing them. Because engineer will tell you the first time you build something, a lot of things will go into the seems like a good idea at the time bucket. And that's probably going to be true of the Kubernetes Identity Management implementation as well. But there are certainly things that you can do that if you really need these features now and you want to start to use them, that can help insulate you. Some best practices that I'm going to recommend here. So first off, and this is really true of any identity management implementation. You know, at the beginning, I mentioned that most implementations I was a part of, I was brought on because the implementation was considered a failure. Very few times have I been able to start from scratch and build things the way I'd really like to do it. And most of the time, the failure resides in a couple of places. Sometimes it's technology, sometimes it's the implementers, but most of the time it has to do with overcomplicating things and the underestimation of the implications inside of your organization. So, and I'll show you this in you know, I only have about 700 slides left, so we're doing good. Can't get about 700 slides, I promise. In a future slide, I'll kind of show what I think of as a reference architecture. But one of the things that people really underestimate is most of people's identities are in Active Directory in large enterprise environments. Well, the folks who own Active Directory probably aren't going to be in the same line of command that the folks that are paying for your Kubernetes implementation are in. And so if those goals don't align, trying to get resources out of the Active Directory team that's really focused on managing a Windows network, not managing your Kubernetes deployment, can be really difficult. So the simpler you can keep things, the less those types of organizational impacts will happen. And then, you know, don't reference users directly in your role binding. So when you set up a Kubernetes role, you set up a role, the role says, what does this role have access to? And then you have a role binding that says, who has access to the role? Well, you can name groups. You can also name service accounts. Really bad idea to name users. And the reason is that users can be very ephemeral. They can move around. It's very hard to track. And it's one of those things that, okay, if you're if something changes underneath, if you're using groups, then you're changing maybe 1 or 2 points. If you're changing users, then you have to change it for every single user in the system. Another reason it's not a great idea to mention users is that every time that user base changes, you now have to make direct API changes to your Kubernetes deployment, which can become painful. And then finally, offload as much as possible to your identity provider. It will be tempting to try and do as much inside of Kubernetes as possible for no other reason than you as the implementer might have the most control that you do over Kubernetes. However, the more that your identity provider does, the less likely changes in the 1.3 API design will affect your current deployment. To give you some ideas as to what those changes might be, there's been discussion of, since a certificate can't tell you what groups a user has, you have to define that someplace else. And since Kubernetes doesn't have a method of looking up users, of adding a second authorization step to allow for using a certificate to be able to apply that certificate to an account that then has groups. So those are some of the things that could really impact a deployment. So if you're using your identity provider, I'm going to list a couple of here in a future slide. You know, do as much as you can there, because there's going to probably be less change on that side than inside of Kubernetes. So how does it all work? Let's get into the meat of it. So this is what I think of as a reference architecture for a identity managed SSO-aware Kubernetes deployment. We have a few different pieces here. So obviously Kubernetes, right? And then over here, I'm using Keycloak as my identity provider. I'll list a few others. And then we have a data store here. Now I went with a virtual store. What I wanted to be able to do was say, okay, I'm going to assume I don't own my Active Directory, so I need to store roles someplace. I need to store groups someplace. So I wanted to experiment with the idea of using a virtual directory. to manage your groups in one data source, but your users in another data source, and then bring them together virtually using a virtual directory. So that's what our demo is actually set up to do. So I've got a virtual directory, my virtual directory, our open source virtual directory, Active Directory where my users are, and then I'm keeping my roles as attributes inside. In this instance, free IPA server. Only reason why I went with this particular configuration was I actually had already set up for a different demo, so I figured less work I need to do to get things working, the better. And then finally up here we have OpenUnison. OpenUnison is our flagship open source project, is the basis for our commercial product, and it's got several different functions, which you'll see. One is a reverse proxy, so that's how we're actually going to handle security for the Kubernetes dashboard. We'll show you how we do SSO with that. It also has a workflow engine for user provisioning. So once you have access, how do you determine who should have access to different roles without users having to manually add users to groups? And then finally, that redirect system that Kubernetes doesn't have, OpenUnison will give you. So we will manage the redirects, and then we have an app that we call Token that will actually let you display a token. So in this instance, it'll be your access token for Kubernetes. So this all happens really fast. That's why I like to go through the screen first. It's sometimes hard to appreciate how much is going on in the background. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to access OpenUnison. OpenUnison is going to say, don't know who you are. I'm going to redirect you over to Keycloak. Keycloak is going to say, I still don't know who you are. Let's go ahead and collect your credentials. Collect the credentials, redirect you back to OpenUnison, and then we do a back channel call to Keycloak to get your access token. It's OpenID Connect, so your access token is a JWT, a JSON web token. This is a bit of JSON that has who you are, some date and time information. It's also digitally signed. So Kubernetes can check this and not have to phone home to validate it, which is really great. At which point, OpenUnison presents you a portal, and you can click on some links. One is going to be for the dashboard, assuming you're authorized. The other is going to be to get your token. So we're going to click on the dashboard. When we click on the dashboard, every request that runs through OpenUnison to Kubernetes API server will actually have your JWT token embedded in the request. It'll be injected. So you're authenticated with OpenUnison, and then OpenUnison tells Kubernetes who you are by injecting that bearer token for you. So that's how you get SSO into the Kubernetes dashboard. Then, of course, you want to use kube-control, right? And so you use the scale token application to be able to copy the token, paste it into your command line, and you're off with the races. What's the benefits of this approach? A couple of them. One, you've got, with the browser-based approach when it comes to authentication, a lot more options. If you're just doing username and password, okay, I could see why the browser paste might be overkill, but in all the different multi-factor capabilities out there, most of them are designed around a browser. So this makes that a lot easier. And unless you're physically sitting at a terminal, which I suppose is possible, for the most part, you're probably going to be accessing it remotely anyway on a windowed system, whether it's Windows, Mac, Linux, whatever. So this model provides a lot of flexibility. And then here's the model for provisioning. Wanted to separate it out so you can get an idea what's going on. The authentication process is the same. So the user accesses OpenUnison, authenticate via Keycloak. Now, if I request access for an application, the way that's done is by a workflow. And so in OpenUnison, we have these what's called a dynamic workflow, where we're actually able to talk directly to the Kubernetes API server. And so you can put annotations on a namespace, a group, a role, any object out there that can be listed by the API server that says what this group does, what information needs to go into the dynamic workflow, things like who the approver would be or approvers, description information, things like that. And so you log in. I'll show you this as part of the demo, and you request access. That goes to an approver. The approver says okay, and it gets provisioned into this data source. Here we're using Red Hat's free IPA. Even here in DC, the acronyms can drive us a little batty. And so we go ahead and we update an attribute. And so when you go ahead and you get your access token, that's actually coming out, the group actually comes directly out of free IPA. So how do you set all this up? It's actually really easy. Once you get through a few things. So first you need an identity provider. Keycloak, Dex is from CoreOS. You can use Google. I've heard of folks using Azure AD. I'm actually going to give you guys a link. I'm going to post a bunch of links to the Meetup board after we're done with the presentation, one of which will be a nifty little utility if you're using Google to be able to authenticate without a browser, if that's something that you find important. But you got to pick an OpenID Connect identity provider. Make sure to avoid anybody who says OpenID 2 or OpenID 1. They have nothing to do with OpenID Connect. They share similar names and branding, but they're completely different and incompatible systems. If you're going to go with a local identity provider like Keycloak or Dex or one of the others that are out there, make sure that your certificate is signed by a CA. It doesn't have to be signed by a commercial CA like Thought or GoDaddy or whatnot, but you cannot use a standalone self-signed certificate. The way that Golang is at, we actually narrowed this down to it's a Golang issue. It's not a Kubernetes specific issue where it can't verify a self-signed cert on its own. You have to have something signed by a CA. And again, this will be a link that I'll post in the board. CoreOS has a nifty little script that's easy to customize that you can just go ahead and it'll generate the certs for you. And that's what I ended up doing to get my Keycloak server up and running. Everything is through additional API server parameters, and most of the quick starts will not work. I think I fielded 2 questions alone in the last 48 hours asking about Minikube being able to do SSO and RBAC. Can't do it right now. I know Minikube has an open issue to be able to pass in server flags right now, unless you compile it, won't work. Same is true of like the generic Vagrant image. I wasn't able to get working with Google either. In fact, the only one I was able to get working with for the quick starts was CoreOS's single Vagrant image that has both a master and a minion all on one image. Worked beautifully with that. So if you want to just dabble, play around, but you don't have an existing lab to work in, I would definitely recommend that. And again, another link I will make sure to post. So you have a bunch of parameters you got to put in here. These are all pretty straightforward. Your issuer URL. This is a URL to, this is a URL to your OpenID Connect server that will load up all the metadata about the server. So certificates, different URLs for token management, parameters, stuff like that. Client ID, this is how your client identifies itself to your OpenID Connect identity provider. The username claim, aka attribute. This is the name of the attribute or claim inside of your JWT that identifies you as a person or as a user. Group claim, same idea, except what are the list of groups that you have? And then finally, your certificate authority file. RBAC, similar setup, all the same disclaimers as SSO when it comes to setup here, but a couple additional things that you got to keep in mind. So one, you have to go ahead and add this RBAC authorization KTIO v1 alpha 1 to your runtime configs. That turns it on. And you've got to turn on the authorization mode. You can have multiple authorization modes. I'd be very, very careful with that design. More complicated your security is, more likely it is to fall apart. And then finally, you need a super user. Chicken and egg problem. When Kube first starts up, it has no policies. So how do you, but also RBAC will not allow you to give policies that you don't yet have. So how does somebody who has no policies give policies that they aren't authorized to do? You have a super user. And the super user, this is a root user where no policies apply. You can do anything. You can use SSO for this. There is a trick, though, where if you are using SSO in OpenID Connect, your issuer URL needs to be prepended to the name of your user, unless it's an email address. And there's some discussion as to whether or not that's an appropriate way to do this. If you have a certificate that you're using pre-SSO setup, that is often the easiest way to go. Your user would be the common name part of the subject of your certificate. So for instance, the single instance VM or vagrant that I use creates something cn equals kubeadmin, da 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 da. That's where the kubeadmin comes from. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and demo. Real quick check. Everybody can see my screen?
Yep, we see it.
Okay, great. So I am going to start off with logging in. So I'm going to start logging in with a power user here, just to give you an idea. And, you know, everything just happened, right? You didn't see the fact that I first went to Scale.js, got bounced over. You know, you obviously saw me put in my credentials, and then all the stuff behind the scenes. That all happens very, very quickly. And so first thing I'm going to show off is I am authorized to, and if we look at my user, this admin role is my Kubernetes admin role. And that's what's giving me access to the Kubernetes dashboard. So if I click on the dashboard and bada bing, bada boom, I am signed in. You know, again, this is all happening very quickly behind the scenes. You're not really seeing a lot of the orchestration that has to go into this working. But, you know, everything works great. And then I'm going to go ahead and close that. And I am going to load up my access token. I don't do it this way, but you actually can just drop this token right into your kube config, and kube control will know how to use it. Kubernetes will also know to reload it, because these tokens are actually very short-lived. And to give you an idea as to what that would look like, I'm just going to go ahead and copy that, clear. Oops. Might help if I knew how to type. So I'm just going to go ahead and paste my token. This is from Keycloak. And, you know, cluster info. So you can see that I've got everything up and running. And I'm going to go directly to here. So this is my Kubernetes API server. Now, if I try and bypass the Open Unison reverse proxy and go to the UI, first it's going to say certificates don't work, obviously, but unauthorized. So I can't bypass that proxy, which is really important. So I'm going to go ahead and log out. Now, I don't have single logout set up here, so I'm going to go ahead and delete all my cookies. I'm going to log in again, this time as an unprivileged user. So if there are any Star Wars fans out there, bonus points if you know who Jason Solo is. So you can see I've got a token. I don't have my my Kubernetes dashboard. That's because I don't have access. And if we look at my roles, that admin role's not there. So I'm just going to go ahead and show you there's nothing up my sleeve. I'm going to pull up, sorry, there we go. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and pull this up. I'm going to run kube control with it. Now, I don't have access. So even though I'm authenticating, I'm not authorized. So this is going to give me an error. You can see, no idea what's going on because the RBAC system's stopping me. So this is where the management part of identity management really comes in. So I'm going to go ahead and request access. Now, this is listing by namespace. I took that idea from the way that we did our original integration with OpenShift, which basically maps a namespace to a project. And so I've actually got annotations in each individual namespace that says what group is the admin for this project, description information. So I was able to, this is coming live out of my kube system. So if I'm going to go ahead and add access to, request access to the kube system namespace. And then again, when it comes to reports, you want to see who to go bug. So I'm going to go ahead and log in as my super user again. I don't know if you just heard that bing, but that was actually me finding out that I have an open approval. So I'm going to log in and see I've got this open approval. Now this is all open source, so you can download this and start playing around with this today. I'm going to review the request. Here's information about me for a demo. I'm going to approve. And so once I hit confirm, what's going to happen is Open Unison is going to say, all right, I'm going to add the admin attribute into the data source that's used to identify what groups you're a member of. So that's been done. And just to show you, I can go see completed approvals, workflow name, here was the label, here was the person, and it was approved. So I'm going to go ahead and log out, log back in as my test user. So now you can see I've got access here, and this is the attribute that's going to get sent. This is the attribute value that's going to get set to Kubernetes so that when I go ahead and log in and I try to do something, it knows that I am in fact able to do these things. And in fact, I click on the dashboard. Here I am in the dashboard. Now the dashboard doesn't actually know who I am. Kubernetes knows, but the dashboard itself doesn't. And so that's why there's nothing that says, welcome Mark Borstein or anything like that. And then let's go ahead and let's close this tab. Can I move this thing? Oh, I can. Good. Never mind. So I'm going to close this. So previously I couldn't access anything. So let's go ahead and use my new token. And cluster info. And now you can see I'm actually able to use the Kubernetes API. Now, access requests are important, but the other part of management is turning off access. So here I'm actually going to use a very simple example where I'm going to request to be removed. In actuality, this would be some kind of automated process because my role has changed. I don't work here anymore. Any number of reasons why. So I'm going to log back in. And we will see that this again. I've got this open approval. So you can see I've got this request to please remove per request. I'm actually going to move that again. Deny the request. So this time, instead of making sure that the user has the attribute value of admin, I'm going to remove it. And if I come to reports and I see all approvals completed by me, you'll see I actually rejected the user. And what I can actually do here is show another report, which is our single user change log at no.com, I think. No. JSolo at, oh, I know why. Single user change log. jsolo.mtk12.domain.com. There we go. And then I'm going to come down here to the bottom. You can actually see earlier today, this is when I added the attribute, and this is when it was deleted. So now I'm going to go ahead and clear out. And log back in as jsolo. See, I do not have dashboard access anymore. I don't have that admin role. If I try and use my new token, it's not going to work. Oops. Go away. Go. No. 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 Go away. Thank you. So, show you there's nothing up my sleeves. And then let's go ahead and load my token. And help if I knew how to type or even copy and paste. And you'll see, didn't work. I couldn't even get the API version because RBAC was stopping me. So that kind of shows you the entire life cycle. It also shows you I have this idea as a reference architecture. This is all really new in the Kubernetes world. So there's a lot of things still to shake out. Things like baseline roles. Where do you even start? That's usually the first question. Okay, I got roles started, now what? Here I used a really simple, you're either an admin or you're not. As kind of people start using this, I'm sure more is going to shake out around the types of roles that people are going to use. And then from project level, some of the stuff we're thinking about doing is making this aspect a little bit easier to deploy. We're actually in the process of building out a MongoDB virtual directory connector and provisioning connector. So instead of having to use that free IPA server, if you're not a directory group, you don't want to manage a directory, being able to use that for the attributes. So we're doing some fun stuff around that now that we've got this working. So coming back to the presentation, this is my last slide. A little bit of shameless self-promotion. If you're here in the Washington, D.C. area, I'll be giving a very similar talk at Google DevFest DC here in Northern Virginia on the 24th and 25th. Tremolo Security is going to have a table at KubeCon, and with a little bit of luck, we'll also be presenting. So please swing by. On the web, you can find us at tremolosecurity.com or tremolo.io, and our open source project on GitHub. And, thank you very much for spending some time. I look forward to your questions.
All right. Thank you, Mark. Okay, so now we are going to get started with the question and answer part of the presentation. So if you have a question, please click on chat, and then next to 2, you should see my name, Johan. So just send me a private message with a question, and I will read it out loud. So go ahead and do that now. Okay, so still waiting to see if anyone is typing a question. Okay, there we go. We have a question from Sebastian. And his question is, what is the status for K8s 1.4? What are the plans?
So I'm not actually on the Kubernetes team. I'm, I guess I would say, more of a power user. So the best place to answer that from a definitive standpoint will be just to go to GitHub. When it comes to what I've seen people talking about, it's been primarily around, one, trying to make the process that I showed you for configuration easier. 2, creating a separation between authentication and authorization. The ability to assert your groups is great for OpenID Connect, but if you're using certificate authentication, not so much. Because if you think about it, there's no way to really do that with the certificate. And there are, but it's kind of painful. And so there's a desire to have an ability to say, okay, well, if you can assert what your groups are, great. But if you can't, have some kind of way that you could go look that up. So that's been one that's come up. When it comes to the actual creation of policies, right now it's a very static model. So I define a role, I define a role binding. If I need to change that role binding, I have to do either a kube control edit, or I have to do a drop and recreate. However, there is a PR in place to be able to have a web service for doing that. So more verbs around your RBAC policies. So instead of saying, okay, here's my role binding, you can say, add Mark to this role, rather than change the role binding and redeploy. Very similar to the way OpenShift does it. Folks that are doing the work in Kubernetes, a large percentage of them have also done this on OpenShift. So a lot of the lessons learned from OpenShift are coming back into Kubernetes. There has been talk of potentially adding more authentication methods. I haven't seen a lot of very serious discussion of that. I would guess LDAP might come into play at some point, but nobody's really banging down the walls, at least that I've seen for it.
Okay, so we have a few more questions here. Let me just make sure I get them in order. So Rio is asking, he's saying, I have been running a small cluster at work for a couple of months now, so I'm quite new to this. Right now, is exposing the API server to the internet okay, and done a lot? The API server.
Is that a question?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Oh, sorry. What was the...
Sure. Right now, is exposing the API server to the internet okay, and done a lot?
Like, is it okay to be exposing the API server to the internet? Is that the question, or?
Correct. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. Depends. The API server is basically just a really powerful web server. So if it's locked down well enough, and that well enough, I'm using my quotey fingers if you're watching, really depends. If you are using SSO and you're using RBAC and you're using security best practices around those credentials, I don't see why not. I would probably, if I was doing it for a corporate enterprise or something, I would probably add an additional layer, like a VPN or something on top of it, just to make sure that the folks who analyze policies don't have a stroke looking at that. Sometimes perception beats reality. But just the API server is basically just a web server. So whatever the principles that you would have when you're dealing with the web server, I would apply to an API server. So reverse proxies are always a good thing. Adding more security and authentication, understanding what your threat environment is, things like that.
Great, and let me just check here. One moment. Okay. So we have one more question. Do you see that the SSO can be extended to any app/container deployed in Kubernetes?
So if I'm interpreting that question correctly, you're asking not only can you do SSO into the Kube API server, but also for apps running inside of Kubernetes. Yeah, I mean, that's more app dependent than Kubernetes dependent, really. OpenID Connect is a very well-established, I mean, it's been around for a few years now, and most OpenID Connect identity providers are generic identity providers. They'll support OpenID Connect or SAML2, or pick your favorite new protocol that gets created every few years, and so that would really be more about your application. We did, any folks who are well-versed in the OpenShift world, we did an OpenShift Commons briefing about 4 months ago, where we did actually SSO into WordPress running on OpenShift. So the exact same principles would exist.
All right. So it seems that that was the last question. If you have another one, you can try to sneak it in before we wrap it up here. I am going to also do a little bit of self-promoting, but it's for the community. If you liked the talk and you felt inspired and you want to give your own talk, it's very easy to apply to do so. You can just click on that link there. We might be changing the method of application soon, but for now, that will work, and your application will get through. Mark, thank you so much for coming. It was a pleasure to have you, and I'm sure the folks enjoyed as well. If you have any links that you wanna give to the folks, you can do that on the chat screen there. And if anyone has any questions, not just for Mark, but to each other, I'm going to leave the chat open for just a little bit longer in case you have any conversations that you want to have. If not, then just look out for the announcement for the next speaker 2 weeks from now, and we hope to see you then. Thank you very much.